From the CUBE studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the CUBE and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
We're in the cusp of a new software-enabled business model that will determine winners and losers in the coming decades. We call this service as software. Specifically, we believe enterprises will begin to organize knowledge work in new ways that harmonize islands of automation into a build-to-order assembly line for knowledge work. Firms that aggressively pursue this opportunity will be on a learning curve that we think will create sustainable competitive advantage and, importantly, a winner-take-most dynamic. Now, we're not just talking about technology vendors here. Rather, we believe new technology, operational, and business models will emerge and apply to all enterprises across every industry. In this breaking analysis, George Gilbert, Paul Nashawaty, Savannah Peterson, Jackie McGuire, and I present a new way to think about how businesses will operate in the AI era, with implications for application developers, edge deployments, and security governance models, with a glimpse toward the path that we think organizations can take to go from where they are today into the future. George, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Always good to be here, Dave.
All right, Alex, if you would bring up the first chart. Every time there is a major shift in technology, there is a change in the technology architecture, the operational models, and the business models. So, for example, when we went from on-premises software to SaaS, we went from a technology model that was all owned by the enterprise to ultimately a multi-tenant model. The operational model was very much do-it-yourself, went to managed services, and the business model went from heavily CapEx to eventually subscription-based models. We think that there's a similar dynamic occurring with service as software in the Agentic era. And George, I'd love for you to add some context to this slide and to take us through how you see the technology, operational, and business model changing quite dramatically.
Okay, one thing to emphasize that's a profound change is the two previous eras, on-prem and SaaS, software as a service, were limited to IT. And the technology model, the operations model, and the business model were only within that corner of the house and only affecting the vendors who were suppliers to that side of the house. What we're saying now is that the technology model, the operations model, and the business model for the entire customer organization is going to change. That's new, and specifically, what we're trying to say is that in the past, when it was on-prem, and even with SaaS, you just had islands of automation. You had an ERP system which did your sort of back office systems. There was a dream at one point that would provide end-to-end automation, but then we had, with the rise of the internet, really dozens and then hundreds and now thousands of applications that sprung up around that, most notably like CRM. And CRM was the first really to offer a new operations model where it was delivered, from the cloud. And that offered a new business model where it was subscription-based instead of on-prem license. But what we're saying now is that the entire customer organization is going to become like a software company. And so the technology model has to change, where you need essentially now to harmonize all those islands of automation that were individual applications. Those need to be one unified layer where the data and application logic collapse into one integrated layer. And we call that the system of intelligence. And agents need that harmonized layer so that they have context from across the organization to make a decision, and then to be able to operationalize that decision by calling one of the legacy apps to invoke a workflow to perform work. But then for that to really, for an organization to take most advantage of that, they need a new operations model. And that's what we're calling the build-to-order assembly line for knowledge work, where the build-to-order part is you're enabling the customization that you would get from like a consulting firm, but you get the efficiency that you would get from, let's say, a volume operation like an e-commerce fulfillment company. We're combining the two. That we've never done before. And the way that's going to be possible is that humans are going to supervise agents, and in supervising the agents on this knowledge work assembly line, they're gradually encoding more and more of their expertise. And then when you put all this together, that enables a new business model where you're basically now on an experience curve. You're not looking at one agent, you're looking at an army of agents in your organization where you're gradually encoding the decision-making expertise of your organization. Progressively, more of it goes into the agents. As your machine learning models learn to predict like how processes work, how customers respond, you go down this learning curve. So you put the two together, you have greater and greater differentiation from encoding more specialized expertise, and you have lower costs. So you put the two together, greater pricing power from greater differentiation, lower costs from this declining marginal cost, more of it being digital, and you're going to get a winner take most dynamic, because you're going to see the same dynamic that you had in consumer online services, where you had differentiation and cost advantages. Only you're going to see that now in any business that has knowledge work, even a manufacturing enterprise, because you're going to see it in the knowledge work component, the management part of a manufacturing enterprise. That's the profound change that we see coming.
Right, and this is probably the reason why Jamie Dimon is organizing or trying to organize this whole company, around this new era. David Floyer, of course, has been very vocal about a new breed of AI native companies are going to come out of the woodworks with productivity metrics that blow away anything that we've ever seen before from a revenue per employee standpoint. And so this is really an imperative. But let's take the sort of those three dimensions, the technology model, the operational model, and the business model, and break them down a little further. So this next slide really digs in to the technology piece of it, where we're going from application silos. Data is very fragmented to this unified platform. And George, you've pointed out many times, even if you shove all your data into a data lakehouse, it's still fragmented, even though it's physically maybe consolidated, because you've got a cube for sales, a cube for marketing, a cube for finance. So their own data sets that they own, but they're not really harmonized across, the organization. And so what this, again, shows that sort of migration from on-prem, where the customer managed the activities, to the IaaS and PaaS, where the vendors manage it. And the green is indicated as sort of the future, if you will, and it probably could, cut across the entire stack here, because we will see a hybrid approach of both on-prem and cloud. But at the top, George, you've got this concept of a system intelligence, something that we've talked to extensively. We feel like this is an increasingly important piece of real estate that's going to feed agents. You've got points here like what happened and why, but we've never been really great on what's next, what's going to happen, and what should we do next. We've talked about this in previous breaking analyses episodes, but please add some color to this portion of the technology discussion.
So the most important point to make is that the problem with islands is that it impedes management's core function, which is to plan, to allocate resources, to orchestrate activities with full visibility. And the goal is to have full visibility across all levels of detail and across as wide a span of activities as possible. And the islands of automation, which are your individual applications, get in the way of that. But the irony is the data lakes themselves today are also islands of data, because when you create a star schema, just like you were saying, Dave, each star schema is its own island, because you can't go from, it tells you what happened in sales, but you can't ask, so how did marketing impact this sales? How did the fulfillment activity impact the customer experience? You'd have to create a whole new data engineering project and a whole new set of cubes. And so the point is, today, the way we can get started with agents is you can look inside perhaps one cube, and you can have an agent ask these questions, as in what happened from multiple perspectives within that one domain, that one department, within sales, within marketing. And you might be able to take limited action using an agent calling into this existing system of record with an MCP server. And so, like, it might, you might have within customer service, you might be able to see customer complaints for that particular customer, and you might be able to take some action, let's say to manage a return authorization or something. Limited activity. Again, these are small islands, but to get to that broader full visibility across the enterprise, that's going to take a lot of work, where we harmonize the data and the business processes, and we get to what we've been calling, this is a term and a conceptual model we borrowed from Jeffrey Moore, the system of intelligence. And then the systems of agency are able to have this four-dimensional dynamic view of the entire business. And so the key point to remember is, what we're doing today is just the starting point. And we're trying to get to a point where we have a much richer view. And this is why, this richer view is why Palantir is doing so well right now, is because they build not star schemas, but they build an ontology, which is a four-dimensional map. They build that dynamic four-dimensional map, and that's why they were in such a good position when agents came along. And why we've been so high on Salesforce is they build one where you don't have to build it from scratch. Palantir is like you're building your enterprise applications on top of an Oracle database. Celonis, for example, gives you packaged business processes, so you're not encoding them by hand. Salesforce gives you all your customer-related processes in a data platform and linked to your customer 360 applications. And SAP is moving in that direction with their business data cloud. So these are broader islands now, and we're going to at some point have to stitch them together.
Thank you, George. Appreciate that. And so, thinking about this, there's a lot of changes that are going on inside of the industry, and that has implications on sort of the new stack that's emerging. A shout out to Alex Williams' company. He picked a great name when he chose to name his company. But let's take a look at that that stack in this next diagram. And we've talked about this quite a bit. There's changes going on, there's shifts, there's competitive dynamics. So let's sort of walk through it. At the bottom layer, you've got infrastructure. We're talking about compute, storage, networking, and other parts of the infrastructure, security, observability, there's data movement, and the like. You've got the system of engagement. The generative UX is what you have here on this chart. And we actually think that in some regards, the user interface becomes thinner and thinner, but you're speaking to the system in terms of language. And where we're headed here is, this is how we think the digital representation of the enterprise will be built from a technology perspective. Yes, you've got the data platforms underneath. Think Snowflake, think Databricks. They're doing a lot of good activity in the market. You've got the whole governance thing around it. We've talked a lot about the database becoming less and less of the point of control. Oracle, of course, would disagree with that, but certainly there's a trend in the market toward the governance catalogs being that point of control. That's becoming increasingly open source. Iceberg is driving that. Things like Polaris and Unity from Databricks, Polaris, of course, from Snowflake. And then you've got business logic and application logic an application or a business metadata sort of traditionally locked inside of those application silos. And then there's this new green area emerging, call it the system of intelligence, the digital representation of the enterprise that can interpret context, maybe from the BI systems. Really interesting to see conversations between like Fivetran acquiring DBT. So you're seeing all these movements. Where does Snowflake and Databricks go as they move upstream? They're finding new competition amongst the likes of, as George was mentioning, Celonis and Salesforce and ServiceNow and others. And then, of course, at the application layer, you've got these systems of agents. You've got agent control frameworks that are orchestrating things. And essentially, our vision here, and George, please pick it up, is to create a digital twin of the enterprise. We talked about in previous Breaking Analysis episodes how Jamie Dimon, or why Jamie Dimon is Sam Altman's biggest competitor. And the last one we did in that context was how to get there. And the point that you so succinctly made, George, was the way they get there is to build that digital twin, where we talked about 4D maps. But kind of, let's dig into this diagram a little bit more and get your perspectives on in the context of this breaking analysis.
Okay, so Alex, if you can bring that slide back up, let me talk to it some more. At the data platform level, we've heard a lot about semantic layers, and Snowflake, I think, led an effort to get a big swath of the industry to agree on semantic interoperability definition. I don't know if we have all the details yet, but the idea is, just to be clear, these are the metric and dimension definitions, the metric and dimensions that you see in a dashboard, like customer lifetime value or quarterly sales. Like, so you have to agree on what's the definition of sales, what's a quarter, things like that. And again, though, so that's at that green square at the lower left, just above the data platform layer. And again, to emphasize, the data platform, even if you standardize on one data platform vendor and you have one instance in your organization, it doesn't mean you've unified all your data, because again, every star schema is an island. And that's what the metrics and dimensions are. Because if you want to ask why, and you need a view that involves that touches on say fulfillment, customer service, marketing, one cube is not going to be able to do it. Or I should say the departmental cubes. You're going to have to create a new cube that cuts across departments. And that's a data engineering effort. And ultimately you want that sort of view to be generated on demand. That's part of getting that cross-departmental view. And I think, as Jackie's going to be talking about, this governance model is going to be very critical, because if you, as you open up access to your data more broadly, you're going to have a new governance model that's much more policy oriented and dynamically enforced, and even maybe dynamically generated. And as you're letting agents take more and more actions, perhaps by talking to the system of record, at least initially through MCP servers, you're going to need a governance model that is completely new, which is governing actions. We had governance of APIs in the past, but now you're going to need governance of actions that essentially manage the behavior of agents. And then where we talk about, Dave, as you were saying, the digital twin of operations, that's when you start modeling the business processes. That's very different from metrics and dimensions. Those are 2D snapshots or 2.5D snapshots of what happened. Like that's like customer orders or purchase orders or sales, things like that. Whereas the business processes are, that's how did the customer go through all the touch points in the process of engaging with us? That's a much richer thing. And that is something that customers don't have, for the most part, the ability to model on their own. They're going to need that in terms of building blocks that their vendors provide for them. just the way we had packaged applications over the last 3.5, 4 decades. Customers were not, for the most part, able to build these big applications on their own. We're going to need help from vendors in having process building blocks that customers can compose into these systems of intelligence. And agents will need that. As Savannah is going to talk about, that's the context for the agent as a consultant to think about, to provide, it's the context for the agent to make a decision. So it's a whole new stack that has to come together. And rather than adding new islands, we now have to think about end-to-end integration, not just of data, but of processes.
Thank you, George. So one of the things we're doing in Breaking Analysis now, we're bringing in the broader CUBE research team. So what I want to do now is talk about the implications on application development and the whole life cycle. So Alex, let's bring in Paul Nashawaty. Paul, give us your take.
Dave, thanks for having me. This is great because when we talk about mapping next-gen services software stack to the app dev themes, it actually aligns really nicely when you think about day 0, day 1, day 2, and DevSecOps. In the context of day 0, which is the build, it's basically the planning and design stage of the process. So this is where we figure out how we're actually building on how things are going to run. So from an app dev perspective, it's all about defining the architecture, the APIs, and the infrastructure that's needed. So when you look at services software approach, we can already start thinking about that in terms of modular cloud native pieces, right? The cool part about it is when we can bake in scalability, observability, security right from the start instead of scrambling for it later. When we look at it from a day 1 perspective or the release part of it, it's about deployment and provisioning. So here is where developers are really finally seeing their applications come to life, right? So we see the environments are spun up automatically, usually with infrastructure as code or containers or serverless setups. So devs can really focus on writing code and shipping features instead of wrestling with infrastructure. This is all repeatable, predictable, and much faster than traditional, the traditional setups. And then we look at day 2 operations. This is about the operational parts of the business or the optimization part. This is where applications actually run in production and they start evolving. Developers and operations teams can look at the performance metrics. They can scale dynamically. They can roll out updates without breaking anything. So service as software gets you the telemetry and the feedback. It actually informs you how the application should improve over time. So basically what we're saying is day 2 is where continuous improvement happens. Then you have to overlay DevSecOps, which is tied into this into every single parts of the process and the day and in the process as well. So it's everywhere. Security is really built in from the get-go. It's really automated testing, policy checking, vulnerability scanning. It all happens in the background, but it's integrated into the CI/CD pipeline. So service as software really helps set up the stack that makes secure by default choices so developers can move fast without introducing risk. So Dave, at the end of the day, what we see is the beauty of this approach is the stack handles the heavy lifting and provides faster time to value. What we're seeing in my research is 34% of respondents want that managed service or that SaaS-based kind of a delivery compared to 17% are looking for a pure distribution. Even though there's a reduced functionality with the with the SaaS-based offering, the hosted offering provides a faster time to value over that pure distribution. So the advantage that developers can really focus on features, user experience, and innovation, while the stack ensures everything to run reliably, securely, and at scale. This has significant impact across the CI/CD pipeline and the overall SDLC. So Dave, I think it's really, really powerful.
Okay, coming back to this notion of the sort of 3 dimensions, we've touched on the technology model. Let's look at the operational model. And Alex, if you bring up the next diagram, we're juxtaposing the sort of the way it works today. We're obviously overstating this with wonderful graphics, George, that you did with the help, obviously, of Gemini. So on the left-hand side, there are these islands of automation. And then you've been talking on the right-hand side about this build-to-order assembly line for knowledge work. And I like how you've sort of prompted the humans and the robots. Famously, Mark Benioff's Wall Street Journal article said we're the last generation of managers to manage humans only. Now it's going to be, an individual manager is going to be managing armies potentially of agents. So George, take us through sort of the changes that we should expect specifically in the operational model.
So the important thing to realize is that knowledge work has been very much like pre-assembly line manufacturing. It's artisan, it's sort of small work cells, and there's the process of coordinating and orchestrating work across teams is managed by humans, and it's really it hasn't changed very much across many decades, and the opportunity now is that we can organize work around scarce human expertise. We have to not lose sight of the fact that no matter how much we train agents, we're imparting our knowledge and decision-making expertise to agents over time. That's the idea that in this build-to-order assembly line, we're combining the best of volume operations, and we're borrowing concepts from Jeffrey Moore again, the efficiency of volume operations, but the customization of custom work that you might find in an advisory business like consulting or investment banking. You're gonna get the best of both. But the key thing is, because you have this end-to-end visibility, and you have sort of the digital orchestration of the process, what happens is that human expertise that has not been encoded in the agents, that becomes a floating high value resource that essentially this assembly line brings to bear when it's needed. And every time there's a human intervention, that's captured for future use. So it's like a Tesla autopilot disengagement event that then becomes training data to improve and capture that as an exception condition that doesn't need a human the next time. And so you're designing your workplace to encode human expertise in the process of doing work. And so your capacity is continually expanding through the ever improving agent maturity. And essentially you're building out this build to order assembly line as an evergreen capital project, only it's not a capital project, it's part of your OpEx. And the goal is expertise amplification, human expertise amplification, as opposed to today it's departmental efficiency metrics like deals closed or time to market. Here you're looking now at return on intellectual capital.
Yeah, now you referenced a couple times security and governance in our pre-meeting. Paul Nashawaty made this really emphasized that we can't gloss over the compliance, regulation, the governance, and certainly the security, especially in regulated industries. HIPAA and healthcare, FinServ, you got EU regulations, et cetera. We've covered the technology model and the operational model. Let's dig in to the business model. And if you would, Alex, bring up the next slide. So here we're talking about, on the left-hand side, more labor, more profits, hopefully you can scale, depending on what business you're in. Your marginal economics at volume vary. If you're a software company, you got non-recurring engineering costs, you incur those. Yeah, you got some ongoing maintenance, but generally speaking, your cost at volume, your marginal cost eventually goes to close to zero. If you're a hardware company, you've got some COGS that are associated with that, and services is the classic. Labor is the key input, and you may even have diseconomies of scale and have difficulty getting operating leverage. On the right-hand side, George, you're envisioning a completely different environment. You've been talking about this digitally encoded expertise. I call it the sort of autodidactic, self-learning sort of system. And that becomes the key input as these learn over time. And that's why you're talking about a winner take most, not just in the technology business, but in all industries. So pick it up from here, George, and drill into this concept.
Let me start with the picture, because it was kind of trying to make a point with that humorous, take a law firm, because this is the first service business that where people are trying to reinvent it as a software company entirely. And the joke was to show that, it hasn't really changed all that much since the Dickens era, when they might have worked with quill pens at, standing desks. And the idea is, over time, I should say first, in that business, you want to take on more business, you take on more lawyers. And so your cost essentially scaled, with your revenue, and your reputation was, competitive advantage was really relationships and reputation that you build over time. And it's like a fee-based business. And in law, it's often time and materials, maybe not materials, but it's time-based, or markup thereof. Now, what happens in the new world when you make law more into a software business, you get these platform economics. Your marginal cost decline on an experience curve, because each time you encounter a new type of situation, you capture that expertise in the agent, and the next time you don't need the human lawyer. But as you can see in the picture, the human lawyers are essentially just overseeing an assembly line of agents. And so what happens is, for each type of what might have been a certain type of contract or an M&A type of work, or some type of business that was time-based, now can become a fixed fee service. And as you get better with it, as you get more volume, you get better at it. And so you get both increasing differentiation and lower cost. You get these data network effects, and you get encoded expertise. So that's what drives the winner take most dynamics. And essentially, most of these businesses, they become platform businesses. And that's a profound change.
So Savannah Peterson does a lot of work and is constantly emphasizing to our teams that you have to think about the human element here. And what does that mean for Agentic? And she's got some thoughts as well on the edge. So let's go to Savannah. Let's bring her in. All right, let's hear from Savannah Peterson on the implications for edge. Savannah, take it away, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Dave. Very excited to chime in on this conversation. As you know, I've had the good fortune of getting to work with George Gilbert on a fair bit of this research, and he's actually educated me on a lot when it comes to Agentic and what that really means. And when I zoom out, as you know that I like to do, and think about what this really means for humanity, or how we think about this as people, agents as people, we're not all agents. I think of it more as consultants. And when we're thinking about services as a software, I can't help but think about consulting services as a software. And I think of these agents as consultants within a business that can tap into both institutional knowledge within that organization, as well as industry best practices and business processes that we're learning, whether that be from the experiences that these organizations and enterprises are having, from data that's coming from their edge devices, or a menagerie of other things. So agents are really just little consultants within your organization. I think it makes it a lot easier to chew on when you think about some of the complexity here. But I also want to share two examples from customers that we've had the opportunity to work with recently that really reflect this. And there's two styles of how companies are talking about Agentic and measuring Agentic impact. I'm sure you've seen this. There are the companies saying 500,000 agents deployed, or X business value already achieved, or this level of ROI. And I think that's really interesting, because we wouldn't necessarily say the number of consultants that are on something or the number of clicks that we did in a given day or the amount of tasks that we completed, that's not necessarily how we talk. We would talk about the business value achieved and whether that's money saved or opportunity realized or happiness gained in NPS and customer satisfaction, whatever that might be. Those are actually the incomes that are going to, or the impacts and the measure of what's going to drive true adoption, both at the enterprise and at the consumer level. One of the companies I think that's approaching this differently right now is Workato. I appreciate that when they deployed their Agentic program and launched it, they didn't talk about the number of agents they were going to have out there in X number of companies. They call them genies. And I like this terminology, A, because it's very approachable, but it also feels a bit more dynamic. When I think of an agent, it's an automation. It feels like a chatbot on steroids, whereas true leverage of Agentic will involve things that are including a Z-axis, where there's a reasoning and a decision-making and the ability to acquire information in ways that wasn't really possible before, in a way that is potentially magical. I think at this early stage, we're not even necessarily asking enough of these MVPs and these POCs that we're doing with Agentic because we don't realize what's actually potentially possible because we've never been able to do it before. So I think that setting up their programming, their marketing, their efforts around business impact and tangible success metrics around that versus just the number of agents deployed is a very smart and savvy move. I think that's how people and companies think and communicate about this stuff. I also want to build on something that Paul very astutely brings up, which is compliance, governance, regulation, a conversation that isn't necessarily even as much at the forefront as I think it needs to be when we're talking about the sheer volume of data, not only that exists now, not only that will exist with AI implementation at scale, but when we truly deploy agents at scale, that's going to be a whole nother order of magnitude in terms of data, where that is and where that can be manipulated, interacted with, where value can be extracted from that. And Bob LaLiberte and I had the opportunity last week to be at Equinix's first AI summit and their analyst day. And it was fascinating to really deeply understand the power of long-standing relationships from some of these more venerable companies when it comes to relationships with the government, when it comes to real estate for data centers, when it comes to access to water and power and the necessary support and legislation from each and every different country, region, continent. There are so many different rules that govern what we're about to be able, what we're trying to do. And if companies aren't selecting the right partner at the top to be able to manage that data, meet their data where it is, and ensure the safety of that data as they roll out these programs, they're going to find themselves in a really, really sticky situation. So what I love about what George is really highlighting here is this is no longer a simple transactional thing. It's no longer SaaS. SaaS made a lot of automation faster and it made things happen more efficiently at a task level. What's happening here is happening at an intelligence level. There's an entirely different level of complexity as well as tooling that needs to happen and general strategy that can't, we're not just making simple things faster, we're making very complex things possible. So I think with the agents as consultants, I think with strategic partners, and now, and this is where I promise I'm about to wrap up, when we think about the role of edge devices in this is also a new data center. We're going to have AI at the edge. And these devices, in the same way that IoT has flirted with this for years, edge devices are going to be reporting back into systems, into teams, into managers. George talks about the different role that managers are going to play moving forward and sharing what works best, not just what we think works best, but actually what works best out in the field, no matter who's advocating for it and interacting with that data wherever it is. So I think it's an interesting framework. As a lifelong consultant, it gets me a little excited because there's always a role for more consultants in consulting, and they're going to have to consult on the agents. But it's an exciting time.
So we've covered in some depth the technology model, the operational model, and the business model, which we think is going to have implications on a lot of things, not the least of which is how companies make money, how they charge. this is a framework that we're going to be using to evaluate the future. We're going to constantly update this framework. This is a big part of the work that George is doing with The Economist, that he's collaborating on with a number of folks. And we're going to use this model because really this gets us to service as software and new productivity drivers. And so we're going to evaluate, the future in this context. So let's wrap here. The last slide, we'll run through some key indicators to watch, and then George, I'll let you wrap. A big question is incumbent enterprises, like, what are they going to do with all that technical debt? George, your note here is, will they kick dead whales down the beach? So that's sort of a metaphor for what they're dealing with. Or are they going to transform their models along the dimensions that we just had talked about and align with the service as software, framework that we've developed? Because really we're looking, back to David Floyer's premise, massive productivity gains. And if they don't move fast, they're going to get disrupted with new types of services that are going to be delivered as software, and they're going to have marginal software economics. We saw in the 80s and 90s what Microsoft did with that. When they had that learning curve, they were able to bundle capabilities and services, together, or software together, function together. But this is a significantly more dramatic change. But this is not easy. This isn't just like adopting cloud. It's not just another, security model or framework, or it's not a new, data platform. It's transformational, at the heart of organizations, and you're doing that, as you're doing existing business. So very challenging, and there's a lot of missing pieces. In our research meeting, we talked about being able to harmonize data. We talk about that all the time. Getting your data house in order, data hygiene. How are agents going to talk to each other, and how are you going to secure that? What does pricing look like? I don't think anybody really knows how to price, Agentic. You see Salesforce, playing around with it. We were at UiPath recently, and it's not clear how they're going to price to value. There's a ton of data. What about the data lineage? Are there going to be regulations where we have to, hold data for some number of years like we do today? I think, in some industries it's 7 years. Do we have to be able to, recreate the decisions that agents made and be able to explain them? What about the infrastructure economics? Is the hybrid world? We've talked a lot about companies bringing the AI to the data on-prem. So all of this and more, George, really has to be sort of thought through, and it's going to evolve. This is why, George, we always say this is going to take the better part of a decade for this so-called agentic era to really play out. 2025, 2026, not going to be the year of the agent. It's going to be the decade, perhaps, of the agent. Your final thoughts here, George.
Yeah, Dave, really well said that the agents in the enterprise is going to be very, very difficult because to really get value out of it, you need to change so much about your technology model, your operations model, and your business model. I do want to touch on a few things you said. Most importantly, you were talking about pricing for agents, and we've never really had in software, we've never had a point where there's such significant marginal costs in software. In this case, the cost of compute, and then there's actually a new factor of production for vendors, not just technology vendors, but the enterprises themselves, which is data. And when you look at reports that OpenAI is going to be spending 45% of their revenue in 4 or 5 years still on training costs and data acquisition or data curation, and so the cost structure is still something we all have to wrestle with. And you mentioned the whole issue of observability and that being bound up in security. Like we know with traditional data, we've had issues with lineage. Now We're going to have observability related to agents and how they make decisions. We have to keep track of the reasoning traces. And Jackie, I think is going to talk about this. We not just keeping track of the reasoning traces, but the data they use to make decisions. That's like the new lineage. And even if it takes us, 10 years to start working this out in the enterprise, what's not going to take 10 years, though, is to apply Gen AI and agents to the tools mainstream enterprises are using to start just building their everyday software. That's where we're going to see the biggest impact of agentic AI and just even more primitive Gen AI over the next 12 to 18 months. Like, the entire software industry has to remake its tools for mainstream customers around this technology before we get to this service as software remaking the mainstream enterprise. In other words, we're painting a vision of what mainstream enterprises have to remake their own businesses around, but the tooling around which they're going to build those efforts, that's going to change dramatically in the next 12 months.
George, as always, such great work. I really appreciate you taking the time to think through this framework. And again, this will be iterative. This is not the last you've heard of it. So really, thank you for the contribution, as always.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Thanks to Alex Myerson, who's on production and manages the podcast, Ken Schiffman as well. Kristen Martin and Cheryl Knight help get the word out on social media and in our newsletters. And Rob Hof is our editor-in-chief over at siliconangle.com. Remember, all these episodes are available as podcasts. Wherever you listen, just search Breaking Analysis Podcast. We publish each week on thecuberesearch.com and siliconangle.com. You got an idea? We oftentimes have outside guests come in. You can email me at david.vellante@siliconangle.com or DM me at dvellante or comment on our LinkedIn posts. And check out etr.ai. They've got the fantastic enterprise tech survey data. This is Dave Vellante for George Gilbert, Savannah Peterson, Jackie McGuire, and Paul Nashawaty for theCUBE Research Insights powered by ETR. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.